Most people have never heard of the Göktürks. If you know anything about the steppes of Central Asia, you probably think of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. But centuries before the Mongols rode out of the grasslands to conquer half the globe, another people ruled those same vast plains, the Turks, ancestors of dozens of modern Turkic nations whose empire stretched from the gates of Constantinople to the borders of China and beyond. Followers of my constant channels and books already know. But the story of the Celestial Turks, the Göktürks, begins in the 6th century, in a time when the Ruran Empire dominated the steppes and the scattered Turk tribes served as vassals, paying tribute and providing warriors for foreign wars. It's a story that starts with submission and humiliation, with a people who had forgotten they were meant to be free. The Göktürk Chronicles is a new series by yours truly, Emre E. Yavuz. It follows the Ashena clan from their legendary origins through the rise and fall of the first Turk Khaganate. You'll meet Bumin, who gambled everything on a rebellion that could have destroyed his people. His son Usuk, who inherited an empire before he was ready and had to prove himself worthy of it. Istemi, Bumin's brother, who carved out his own realm in the west and proved that sometimes the greatest leaders are those who know when to stand aside and when to step forward. The shamans and warriors, queens and generals who shaped the destiny of half of Asia. You'll discover how brothers became enemies, how a united empire split in two, and how the very success of the Turks contained the seeds of their eventual downfall. The Chinese wrote about them with a mixture of fear and admiration. The Byzantines hired their warriors later on and even married their princesses. The Persians called them both enemies and allies, well, only enemies actually, but the Sogdians had such cordial relations with the Turks that they even developed an own writing script for them. For nearly a century, the Turks were one of the great powers of the early medieval world, yet their story remains largely unknown outside of academic circles. Part of the problem is that the Turks themselves left few written records. The history lives in Chinese chronicles, Byzantine diplomatic reports, and of course the Orhon inscriptions carved on stone monuments but scattered across the steppes. But between the lines of these sources, you can glimpse the human drama behind the rise and fall of empires, their family feuds and political calculations, the moments of courage and instances of betrayal that determined the fate of millions. These are their stories told as they might have been lived. These are the Göktürk Chronicles.
Episode 1: Children of the Wolf. In the shadow of the Altai Mountains, where the great steppes stretched endlessly toward horizons that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the winter had settled over the nomad camps with particular harshness. From the frozen shores of distant lakes to the wind-scoured plateaus where only the hardiest grass survived, the scattered tribes that called themselves Turk bent their backs beneath burdens that grew heavier with each passing season. The Ruran held dominion over these lands now. Their Khan of Khans, ruling from the distant city of Karakoram with the absolute authority of one who claimed the mandate of heaven itself. His tax collectors rode the ancient paths that connected tribe to tribe, their silk banners snapping in the bitter wind as they extracted the tribute that kept their vast empire fed and armed. What had once been a confederation of free peoples had become a collection of vassals, each clan struggling to meet demands that seemed to grow more impossible with every season. Yet, in the felt tents of the Ashina, where the firelight danced against walls decorated with the weapons and honors of 20 generations, older memories stirred. Stories passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son, keeping alive the ember of something that tax collectors and tribute demands could not quite extinguish. Tonight, as the wind howled across the steppes and carried with it the scent of change, one such story would plant a seed that would grow into revolution. The sound of approaching hoofbeats had silenced the Ashina camp an hour before sunset. Now, as the Rouran tax collectors spat into the fire of the chieftain's tent, the acrid hiss of steam seemed to echo the contempt in his voice. Bumin watched from the shadows his small hands clenched into fists as the foreign official continued his inventory with the mechanical precision of a butcher weighing meat. Outside, the wind carried the muffled sounds of distress. Horses being led away, the quiet sobbing of a woman whose son had just been selected for military service. The creak of wagon wheels as the Ashina's wealth disappeared into Ruran coffers. The smell of horse sweat and leather mingled with the acrid smoke from fires being hastily extinguished throughout the camp. 47 horses, the collector announced in accented Turk. His interpreter, a nervous Sogdian merchant with darting eyes, translating the formal counts into court language. Down from 62 last season. Your herds grow, disappointingly thin, Blue Wolf born. The way he spoke the traditional title made it sound like mockery. Bumin's father sat rigidly on his felt throne, the ceremonial wolf pelt draped across his shoulders, seeming somehow diminished in the presence of these silk-robed foreigners. The staff that marked him as chief of the Ashena lay across his knees, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the ancient wood. The winter claimed many, Tuwu replied with careful formality, each word measured and weighed. Disease took the young stock. The wolves grew bold when the snow trapped the herds. Always excuses with you people. The collector, a soft-faced man whose manicured hands had never gripped anything heavier than a writing brush, made another mark on his silk scroll. The scratch of the stylus seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The Khan of Khans requires what the Khan of Khans requires. Perhaps if your herders were more vigilant, such losses could be avoided. Bumin felt something hot and bitter rise in his throat. The man spoke as if winter storms and predators and sickness were things that could be commanded away through superior dedication to their Ruran masters. Through the tent's entrance, he could see 3 guards in scale armor watching the proceedings with the bored attention of professionals who had performed this ritual dozens of times before. You know, the collector continued, his tone becoming conversational in a way that made the hair on Bumin's neck stand up. We had similar explanations from the Bugu clan last autumn. Terrible luck, they said. Unavoidable losses. His smile was the expression of a cat playing with a mouse. Of course, that was before we discovered they had been hiding horses in the northern valleys, hoping we wouldn't notice the discrepancy. The temperature in the tent seemed to drop. From beyond the felt walls came the distant sound of children crying, families in other parts of the camp learning that their contributions had been deemed insufficient. The Bugu were relocated, the collector added with deliberate casualness. Their grazing rights reassigned to more reliable vassals. A pity, really. They had served faithfully for generations. Bumin had heard whispers about the Bugu. An entire clan scattered to the winds, their leaders executed, their people distributed among other tribes as servants. The official story was rebellion, but everyone knew the truth. They had simply failed to meet an impossible tribute demand. 27 horses for the spring collection, the collector continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man stating natural law. Your usual contingent of young warriors. He paused to consult another scroll with theatrical precision. 15 men between the ages of 16 and 25 to serve in the Khan's armies until the first snows. And naturally, the customary gifts to honor his generosity in allowing you to graze these ancestral lands. The last phrase dripped with irony. These had been Ashina grazing grounds for generations beyond count, but now they held them only at Ruran's sufferance, paying for the privilege of existing where their grandfathers had been born. The men, Tuwu said slowly, and Bumin could hear the careful calculation in his father's voice. Some are needed for the spring hunts. Without adequate hunters, the food stores will teach you efficiency. The collector's interruption was sharp as a blade. Or perhaps you question the wisdom of the Khan of Khans. Perhaps the Ashina grow too comfortable in their arrangements. One of the guards shifted slightly, his hand moving closer to his sword hilt. The Sogdian interpreter had gone pale, his eyes darting between the officials and the Ashina leadership as he translated increasingly pointed words. Through the tent walls, Bumin could hear the sounds of the collection continuing. The neighing of horses being loaded onto wagons, the low voices of men saying goodbye to sons they might never see again. "Last month," the collector said, examining his fingernails with studied indifference, "a very interesting report reached the capital. Something about unusual gatherings among the Turk clans, meetings that had nothing to do with trade or marriage negotiations." His gaze swept the tent, taking in every face, every reaction. Secret councils, some claimed, dangerous talk about the old days, when your people knew neither order nor proper governance. Bumin held his breath. He had seen such gatherings, quiet conversations between his father and other chiefs, hushed discussions that stopped when children came too close. Nothing treasonous, just the natural complaints of men ground down by endless demands. But in the collector's mouth, even whispered frustrations became evidence of sedition. "Of course," the man continued, "rumors are just rumors. Still, it would be unfortunate if the Khan of Khans began to doubt the loyalty of one of his most reliable tributary clans. The Ashina serve faithfully," Tu Wu said, and Bumin heard something break in his father's voice. Not just pride, but something deeper. The last shred of dignity that allowed a man to call himself a leader. "Good." The collector made another mark on his scroll, the brushstrokes decisive and final. "Then there should be no difficulty meeting our reasonable requirements. The horses and men will be ready for collection at the next full moon. No delays this time, I trust." The emphasis on the last phrase carried the weight of implied threat. Bumin remembered the previous season's delay, a late spring storm that had scattered their herds just as the tribute collectors arrived. His father had begged for time to gather the animals, explaining about the weather, the injured riders, the foals born dead in the frozen grass. The Ruran had granted the extension and doubled the tribute as punishment for their inconvenience. "No delays," Tu Wu agreed, the words emerging like something torn from his chest. The collector began rolling up his scrolls with the satisfied air of a merchant concluding a profitable transaction. As he stood, straightening his silk robes, his gaze fell deliberately on Bumin. And that boy there, the one trying so hard to remain invisible in the shadow. Bumin's blood turned to ice as the collector pointed directly at him with one manicured finger. "He has an interesting look about him, doesn't he? The kind of intensity I've learned to recognize in my years of service. Young wolves who think they're lions often need guidance to understand their proper place in the natural order." The threat was unmistakable. Bumin felt every adult eye in the tent turn toward him, some filled with fear, others with a protective anger they dared not voice. His father's grip on the ceremonial staff tightened until the knuckles showed white as old bone. "Keep a close watch on that one. Tu Wu Wolfborn," the collector advised with false friendliness. "The Khan of Khans values stability above all things. It would be unfortunate if youthful foolishness brought unnecessary attention to your otherwise satisfactory clan." The Ruran party filed out into the winter evening, their horses' hooves crunching on snow that had already begun to freeze hard as iron. Bumin watched through the tent flap until their lanterns disappeared into the gathering darkness, taking with them 27 of their finest horses and 15 young men who might never see their families again. For a long moment after they left, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant weeping from other parts of the camp, where families were learning the true cost of their survival. The wind that had been merely cold before now seemed to carry the scent of ash and endings. "Buru," Tuwu called quietly to the shadows near the tent's rear wall, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "What do the bones say about this winter?" The old shaman shuffled forward, his carved amulets clicking against each other like the sound of distant bones. "The signs speak of change, Wolfborn," he said in a voice like wind through dry grass. "Though whether that change brings salvation or destruction, even the spirits whisper uncertainly." From behind a hanging carpet that separated the men's section from the women's quarters, another figure emerged. Göktürk, Tuwu's younger brother and war chief of their remaining warriors, still had his hand resting on his sword hilt, though the immediate danger had passed. 47 horses, he said tersely, his warrior's directness cutting through the political niceties his brother was forced to maintain. They counted every mare, every stallion, every yearling colt. "Someone's been watching us closer than a hawk watches prey." "Spies everywhere," Tuwu replied, without looking up from the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, but there was no warmth there. Only the hollow glow of a man who had learned to swallow his pride until it left him empty. Sogdian traders with sharp eyes and sharper memories. Chinese merchants who ask too many questions about things that shouldn't concern them. Even some of our own people, convinced that Ruran's silver buys them protection from Ruran wrath. The smell of mutton fat and barley bread wafted through the tent, the evening meal that would be smaller tonight because of what had been taken. Outside, Bumin could hear the sounds of a camp trying to pretend that everything was normal. The lowing of the remaining cattle, the soft voices of mothers singing children to sleep with lullabies that spoke of better times, the occasional bark of dogs that had learned to avoid the paths where foreign horses traveled. Why do we let them? The words erupted from Bumin before he could stop them, carrying all the frustration and shame and helpless rage that had been building in his chest throughout the collector's visit. Why do we just sit there and let them take whatever they want? The tent fell silent except for the persistent crackling of the fire. Every adult eye turned toward him, and Bumin saw his own desperate question reflected in faces that had learned to accept the unacceptable. His father's gaze was the heaviest of all. Not angry, but tired in a way that seemed to reach down to his very bones. "Because, little Bumin," Tuwu said slowly, using his son's name with a weight of paternal authority and infinite sadness. "We are not strong enough to stop them. Because rebellion means death. Not just for us, but for every man, woman, and child who calls themselves Ashina. Because sometimes survival requires swallowing your pride until you're strong enough to spit it back in your enemy's face." But even as he spoke the words, Bumin could see the doubt in his father's eyes. How long could a people survive by sacrificing everything that made survival worthwhile? How many seasons of diminishment before there was nothing left to preserve? "We were warriors once," Bumin protested, gesturing toward the weapons and armor that decorated their tent. Swords that had tasted enemy blood, mail shirts that had turned aside killing blows, bows that had sent arrows singing across battlefields where Ashina courage had decided the fate of nations. Grandfather fought 20 battles and never lost one. Great-grandfather broke the TLA Confederation with just 500 men. "Aye, boy," Göktürk said, his soldiers' pragmatism cutting through romantic notions like a blade through silk. "They fought other tribes, other confederations, men like themselves, with roughly equal numbers and weapons." His scarred face was grim in the firelight. "The Ruran are not a tribe. They are an empire. They have more warriors than we have horses, more horses than we have people. Their reach extends from the great deserts to the frozen forests, and every year that reach grows longer. The spirits favor the bold, old Börü interjected, his rheumy eyes fixed on something beyond the tent walls. But they also punish the foolish. A wolf that attacks a bear must be certain of victory, or it feeds the earth with its blood. Bumin wanted to argue, wanted to point out that their ancestors had faced impossible odds before, and prevailed through courage and cunning. But the weight of adult certainty pressed down on him, suffocating his protests before they could form. Around the fire, he saw the faces of men who had grown old, watching their people diminish, year by year, tribute by tribute, until even their dreams had become luxuries they could not afford. Yet something in his chest refused to accept defeat. Maybe it was his youth, or maybe it was something deeper, some spark inherited from ancestors who had ridden free across endless grasslands, who had known the taste of victory and the sweet air of independence. As the adults fell into the familiar rhythms of resignation, Bumin felt only a growing ember of defiance. "Come here, little wolf." The voice belonged to his mother, and Bumin turned to see a woman emerging from the women's section of the tent. She was perhaps 30 summers old, her dark hair braided with silver threads that caught the firelight, her face bearing the strong bones and clear eyes that marked her as nobility among the Turk peoples. Behind her came a smaller figure, his younger brother, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Both of you, settling herself on a thick felt rug near the fire, the scent of wool and leather and the faint perfume of dried flowers that she kept in her personal chest created a small island of comfort in the tense atmosphere of defeat. "Sit with me, Bumin. You too, Istemi." Bumin obeyed reluctantly, his head still buzzing with anger and confusion. Istemi, only 5 years old and still young enough to find comfort in their mother's presence, immediately curled up against her side like a wolf cub seeking the warmth of the pack. But unlike his older brother's brooding silence, the younger boy's curiosity couldn't be contained. "Mother," Istemi said, his voice piping with the directness of childhood, "why did the bad men take Borak's big brother? He was teaching me how to string a bow." The question cut through the political abstractions and reached the heart of what their submission cost. Borak was one of the camp children, barely older than Istemi himself, and his brother Tengiz had been among the 15 young men selected for military service. The bow-stringing lessons would not continue. "Because," Ay Hatun said gently, using her younger son's name with infinite patience, "sometimes people take things that don't belong to them, and sometimes those who could stop them choose not to fight." "But why?" Istemi persisted with the relentless logic of a child. "If someone took my bow, I'd fight them. Father says warriors don't let people steal from them." "Istemi," Tuwu warned quietly from across the fire, but there was no real authority in his voice. How could he explain to a 5-year-old the mathematics of survival, the careful balance between resistance and annihilation? "No," Ay Hatun said firmly, though whether she was addressing her husband or her son wasn't clear. "Let him ask his questions. Let them both ask." Her gaze moved to Bumin, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not the resignation that had infected the men, but a deep, quiet strength that seemed to burn like coals beneath ash. "Mother," Bumin said, his voice smaller than he intended, "are we really just slaves?" The question seemed to hang in the smoky air, like an accusation. The word slaves carried a weight that made everyone uncomfortable, not just because of its implications, but because of how close to truth it felt. Bumin saw his father's shoulders tense, saw Uncle Kutluk look away toward the tent walls where shadows danced like accusatory spirits. Ay Hatun, Tuwu said quietly, using his wife's name with something that might have been warning or plea. The boy asks dangerous questions. Questions that need answers, she replied, her voice calm but implacable. She studied her eldest son's face for a long moment, and in her eyes, Bumin saw something he hadn't expected. Not shame or fear, but a kind of patient watchfulness, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. "What do you know of slaves, little one?" she asked softly. Bumin struggled to put his feelings into words, his child's understanding grappling with concepts too large and terrible for easy comprehension. They do what they're told without question. They give up their things when their masters demand it. They can't fight back or say no or choose their own path. His voice grew smaller with each word as he recognized the truth of his own description. Like us. The sound was neither agreement nor disagreement. Ay Hatun reached into the coals with a pair of iron tongs, drawing out a glowing ember that pulsed within her fire. The smell of hot metal and ash filled the immediate space around them. "Tell me, is this ember dead because it is not a great flame?" "No," Istemi piped up, his curiosity overcoming whatever solemnity the adults thought the moment required. "It's still hot. If you put grass on it, it would make fire. Father showed me." She carefully placed the ember back among the coals, where it settled among its fellows like a star returning to the night sky. "Now, let me tell you what you are, my sons. Let me tell you why the southern chroniclers write such strange tales about our people, why the purple-clad merchants from the western seas speak our name with reverence, why even the fire worshippers of the distant lands know the story of the wolf." She leaned back, and her voice took on the cadence of the ancient storytellers, the rhythm that had carried tales across the steppes for 1,000 generations. Around the fire, the other adults settled into listening positions, as if they too needed to hear this story again, needed to remember something that the day's humiliations had tried to steal from them. The wind outside seemed to quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath for what was to come. Long ago, before your grandfather's grandfather was born, there lived a people in the far northern lands. In that time before memory, when the world was younger and the barriers between the spirit realm and the mortal world were thin as morning mist, there existed a nation unlike any other. They were the first speakers of the Turk tongue, their words flowing like wind across grassland, carrying meaning that would echo through 1,000 generations. Their horses were swifter than the deer, their arrows truer than the eagle's dive, and their warriors rode with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. From the endless steppes where the summer sun never set to the dark forests where ancient spirits dwelled in shadows deeper than night, their domain stretched beyond any horizon that mortal eyes could encompass. The tributaries of great rivers carried their trade goods south to lands where strange gods were worshipped in temples built from gold and precious stones, where the very walls of cities were said to capture starlight and hold it prisoner against the darkness. Their herds numbered beyond the ability of any man to count. Horses that ran like wind-made flesh, cattle whose milk flowed like rivers of plenty, sheep whose wool was softer than clouds and whiter than new snow. Their warriors were beyond measure, each one worth 10 ordinary fighters, their skills honed by generations of victory, and their courage tempered in the forge of endless triumph. The nation was ruled not by a single Khan, who hoarded power like a miser hoards gold, but by a council of the wise, men and women chosen for their skill in war and their wisdom in peace, their ability to speak with spirits and their understanding of the ancient laws that governed all things. They spoke with one voice when danger threatened their people. But in times of prosperity, each tribe was free to follow its own path, to honor its own ancestors, to seek its own fortune under the endless sky that belonged to all and none. It was a time of abundance and freedom such as the world had never known before and would never know again. But greatness breeds envy as surely as spring brings floods, and their neighbors grew bitter with resentment that festered like untreated wounds. The prosperity of the Turk nation cast shadows over lesser peoples, making them feel small and poor and inadequate by comparison. In secret councils held in distant cities where the sun was worshipped as a god and the moon feared as a demon. In whispered conspiracies conducted by flickering lamplight in places where treachery was considered a virtue, a great alliance was forged against them. From the east came armies, where the great rivers flowed toward the sunrise, their soldiers disciplined and numerous as ants, trained from childhood to move as one mind in 10,000 bodies. From the west, beyond the salt waters, came horsemen bearing weapons forged from strange metals in furnaces heated by unnatural fires, fighting with techniques learned in wars that had consumed entire civilizations. From the south, where summer never ends, came spearmen led by generals who had conquered a dozen nations and hungered for one conquest, more glorious than all the rest. They fell upon the Turk nation like wolves upon a flock of sheep, their attacks coordinated with the precision of a hunt planned across seasons and perfected through countless rehearsals. But these were no ordinary raiders seeking quick plunder and easy slaves to drag back to distant markets. This was a war of extermination, a deliberate and methodical attempt to wipe the Turk people from the face of the earth so completely that even their name would be forgotten by future generations. Their very existence becoming nothing more than a half-remembered nightmare. The war that followed was terrible beyond human comprehension, beyond the ability of mortal words to describe. Cities that had stood for centuries, their walls decorated with the painted victories of peaceful times, burned for days and nights until their smoke darkened the sky like a permanent winter that would never end. The sacred horses, bred across generations to be the finest in all the world, were slaughtered by the thousands, not for food or profit, but for the simple, savage joy of destruction. Their blood stained the grasslands red from horizon to horizon and drew clouds of carrion birds so vast they blocked out the sun itself. Warriors who had never known defeat, who had never retreated from any battle no matter how desperate the odds, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers that seemed to pour endlessly from every direction. They were cut down as they fought with desperate courage to defend their families and their way of life, their bodies piling high around the burning remains of camps that had housed thousands. The great settlements that had been the pride of their civilization were reduced to ash and scattered bone, while the enemy danced around the flames and proclaimed that never again would the northern horsemen trouble the civilized world. Children were torn from their mothers' arms to be sold as slaves in distant markets, where their Turk features would mark them as exotic curiosities for the entertainment of foreign nobles. The elderly were butchered without mercy, their accumulated wisdom dying with them. The songs and stories of 100 generations lost in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The sacred places where shamans had spoken with spirits for 1,000 years were desecrated and burned, their power scattered to the winds like so much worthless dust. When the killing was finally done, and the last desperate resistance crushed beneath the weight of superior numbers, it seemed as though an entire people had been erased from existence, as completely as if they had never been born. The enemies divided the vast territories among themselves like merchants dividing up the contents of a warehouse, enslaved the few survivors they deemed useful for their skills or their novelty, and believed they had achieved something unprecedented in the history of the world. The complete destruction of a nation so thorough that not even memory would remain. But Gök Tengri, the great sky god who watches over all things with eyes like distant stars, had other plans written in the book of fate. One boy had survived the slaughter. In the chaos of the final assault on the great camp, when the enemy was drunk on blood and victory, and their attention turned to dividing spoils and celebrating their triumph, a single child had escaped their notice. He was perhaps 10 summers old, torn and bleeding from wounds that should have killed him outright. But somehow he had crawled away from the burning tents and made it to the grasslands beyond the immediate reach of pursuit. The enemy had found him there the next morning, grievously wounded and helpless as a newborn creature. And in their cruelty, they had chosen to make sport of him, rather than grant him the clean death that would have been mercy. They cut off his arms and legs with deliberate surgical care, thinking to watch him die slowly while they celebrated their triumph over the last living remnant of his people. But in their drunken savagery, they had not finished the job with the thoroughness it required. And when they rode away laughing and singing songs of victory, the boy still clung to life with a tenacity that should have been impossible. For 3 days and 3 nights, he crawled across the endless steppes, leaving a trail of blood behind him, like a wounded animal seeking some impossible salvation that existed only in the realm of desperate hope. His suffering was beyond description. The constant grinding agony of his wounds, the burning thirst that made his tongue swell until it filled his mouth like a foreign object, the crushing despair of knowing he was the last living remnant of his people, the final witness to their extinction. Carrion birds circled overhead in patient spirals, their harsh cries filling the air as they waited for him to die so they could feast on what remained of the last Turk in all the world. Wolves followed his scent through the tall grass, drawn by the smell of blood and approaching death, but somehow reluctant to deliver the final blow that would end his torment. With each passing hour, his strength ebbed like water from a vessel with too many cracks to mend, until the boy who had once ridden the swiftest horses and shot arrows straighter than his own shadow could barely drag himself forward by inches. By the 4th dawn, he was more spirit than flesh, clinging to life by threads so thin they should have snapped under the weight of a sigh. His vision had dimmed until the world existed only as vague shapes and shifting shadows, and he was sustained by nothing more than a will to survive that defied all reason and hope and the natural order of things. It was then, as the sun rose on what should have been his final morning, that she found him. The great she-wolf came upon him as he lay dying in a hollow between 2 hills, appearing out of the morning mist like a vision from the world of dreams made manifest in flesh and blood. She was larger than any wolf that walks the earth today, her fur the exact color of the eternal sky at twilight, not blue or gray, but something between and beyond both. A hue that existed only in the realm where earth meets heaven. Her eyes were like pieces of the sky itself, cut free and given life, burning with an inner light that spoke of divine purpose and infinite compassion. The pack of ordinary wolves that had been following his blood trail fled before her like shadows before the rising sun. Recognizing the presence of something so far beyond their understanding that it filled them with a terror that was also reverence. She could have ended his suffering with a single merciful bite, putting him out of his misery as wolves do for their own wounded kin when healing is impossible. And continued life means only continued pain. The boy was beyond speech, beyond prayer, beyond anything but the most primitive desire to continue drawing breath. One moment of kindness, one gentle touch of fang to throat, and the last of that great people would have passed into legend and memory, becoming nothing more than a story told around distant fires in languages that had never known the music of the Turk tongue. Instead, Gök Börü, for that was her true name, the blue wolf sent by Gök Tengri himself to serve as the instrument of divine will, took pity on the child in a way that would reshape the destiny of the world. She lifted him as gently as a mother carries her cubs, more careful than any human hand had ever been, and bore him away to a secret valley high in the mountains where no human foot had ever walked and no mortal eye had ever gazed. There, in caves warmed by underground springs that carried the breath of the earth itself and hidden from the eyes of both men and spirits by walls of stone older than time, she tended to his wounds with knowledge that had existed before the first word was spoken. The boy lived with Gök Börü through seasons of slow healing that transformed both body and spirit, learning to speak with her in a language that was neither human nor beast, but something between and beyond both. The original tongue from which all others had sprung, the speech of the world before it was divided into separate realms and opposing forces. She fed him with her own milk until he grew strong again. And gradually, because Gök Tengri willed it, and because love can work miracles that strength and wisdom cannot achieve, she bore him 10 sons who would become the fathers of nations. The children were like their father in form, but carried within them the spirit of the wolf that no purely human child could claim. Each possessed gifts that set them apart from ordinary mortals, senses so keen they could track prey across vast distances by scent alone, strength so great they could hunt with their bare hands and bring down creatures that would flee from armed men, the ability to speak with all the creatures of the wild and understand the secret language of wind and water, and the voices that spoke from stones. They grew to manhood in the hidden valley, learning to hunt the great mountain bears whose claws could rend steel and the swift deer of the high meadows that could outrun arrows. They mastered arts of war and leadership that would one day be their heritage and their burden, each developing talents that complemented and strengthened those of his brothers. One became wise in the ways of healing, able to draw poison from wounds and coax life back into bodies that hovered at the threshold of death. Another learned to read the patterns of weather and season, to predict storms and droughts with accuracy that seemed like prophecy. A third became master of the forge, creating weapons that would never break or grow dull, armor that would turn aside any blow. But the greatest among them was called Ashena, and he alone of the 10 looked beyond the valley walls and dreamed of returning to the world of men. While his brothers were content to live as their wolf mother lived, free and wild and answerable to no authority save their own hearts and the ancient laws written in blood and starlight, Ashena felt the call of something larger, the need to rebuild what had been destroyed, to gather the scattered remnants of his people and forge them into something new and strong and worthy of the sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. When Ashena came of age and his strength was full upon him like the might of mountains, Gök Börü gave him a choice that would echo through all the generations yet to come. He could remain in the valley forever, safe and hidden from the world's cruelties, living the simple life of the wolf with no concerns beyond the hunt and the changing of the seasons. Or he could venture forth into a world that had shown no mercy to his ancestors, knowing that the path would be long and dangerous and that many generations might pass before his descendants knew true freedom again. But he would carry with him the blessing of Gök Tengri and the promise that one day, when the time was right and the stars aligned in their proper courses, the children of the wolf would reclaim their birthright and rule once more over the endless steppes that had been their first and truest home. Ashina chose the harder path, as Gök Börü had known he would from the moment of his birth. With 4 of his brothers, while the other 5 remained to guard the sacred valley where their mother dwelt and where the spirits of their ancestors found refuge from the storms of the world. He descended from the mountains with nothing but courage and Gök Börü's blessing burning in his heart like an unquenchable flame. Slowly, carefully, they began to gather the scattered survivors of the great slaughter, the handful of their people who had escaped slavery or death by hiding in distant lands or serving foreign masters who valued their skills but not their spirits. It was not easy work, and it was not completed in a single generation. Ashina's descendants lived as wanderers, sometimes welcomed by other tribes who recognized their worth, sometimes driven away by those who feared their growing influence or envied their evident nobility. Always they searched for a place they could call their own. Always they remembered the valley and the promise that had been made to them in a time before time. They served other peoples not as slaves chained by force and fear, but as the valuable allies they were, master horsemen whose skills had become legendary across every land where horses were known, warrior leaders whose tactical genius could turn the tide of any battle, wise counselors who remembered the old ways when others had forgotten even their own names and the names of their fathers. And through it all, through the long years of exile and service and patient endurance, they kept alive the memory of who they truly were and what they were destined to become. Until one day, Ay Hatun continued, her voice soft in the firelit darkness, but carrying a certainty that made every listener lean forward. One of those descendants would be born with the strength to reclaim what Gök Börü had promised, the unity of all Turk peoples under the banner of the wolf that flies in the eternal sky. She reached into the wooden chest that sat in the darkest corner of the tent, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the uncertain light like living things. The chest itself was ancient, older than anyone in the tent could remember, its wood darkened by centuries of handling and its brass fittings green with the patina of ages. From within its depths, she drew out a bundle of silk that had seen better days, its purple dyes faded but still rich with the memory of imperial workshops where master craftsmen had labored to create beauty worthy of kings. This silk came from the purple-clad merchants of the Western Sea, she said softly, her fingers caressing the fabric with the reverence due to something sacred. They call themselves Romans, though they rule now from a city called Constantinople, where 2 seas meet and 3 continents touch. She unwrapped the silk with deliberate care, revealing a necklace of silver and amber that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The pendant was carved in the shape of a running wolf, every detail of its form rendered with an artistry that made it seem ready to leap from the silver into living flesh. The craftsmanship was beyond anything their own smiths could achieve, yet somehow it felt more Turk than anything else in the tent. This came from the eastern kingdoms beyond the great river, where the morning sun first touches the earth and ancient dragons are said to sleep beneath the mountains, she continued, her voice taking on the cadence of prayer. There they speak of Turk nobles who serve as generals and advisors to their kings, men whose wisdom guides empires and whose courage shapes the fate of nations. The Sogdian merchants who travel the trade routes carry stories of our people, from the lands of the fire worshippers to the southern mountains, where the sacred texts are written in scripts of gold. Bumin stared at the pendant, transfixed by its beauty and the weight of history it seemed to carry. In the firelight, the wolf appeared to move, its carved legs stretching in an eternal run towards some distant horizon that only it could see. The silver was warm to the touch, despite having been stored in the cold chest, as if it held some inner fire that had nothing to do with the heat of the flames. But even as he marveled at the pendant's beauty, doubt gnawed at him like a persistent ache. Stories were just stories, weren't they? Pretty tales told to make children feel better about their circumstances, to give hope where none existed. What did legends matter when Ruran tax collectors could ride into their camp and take whatever they pleased? "We are not slaves, my son," Ay Hatun said quietly, and her words seemed to answer the doubts he hadn't spoken aloud. Her hands were steady as she fastened the necklace around his neck, despite the magnitude of what she was entrusting to him. "We are seeds scattered by the wind, taking root wherever we land, growing strong in the darkness until the day we can reclaim the sun. The Ruran see only what they wish to see. A useful tribe that provides good horses and steady warriors for their armies. They do not see the wolf that sleeps in our hearts, waiting for the moment to wake." The pendant rested against Bumin's chest, the silver cold at first, but quickly warming to match his body heat. It felt heavier than its size suggested, as if it carried the weight of all the generations who had worn it before him. "This has been passed down through 20 generations of Ashina chiefs," his mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the tent. "From Ashena himself, who received it from Gök Börü as a token of her promise, to your father, who wore it when he took his place as leader of our people. One day, if you prove worthy of the blood that flows in your veins and the spirit that dwells in your heart, it will be yours to keep and yours to pass on." "When?" Bumin asked, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the tent walls. The question felt enormous, too large for his child's throat to contain. "When will we be free?" The answer seemed to hang in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Around the fire, the adults waited with the patience of those who had learned to measure hope in generations rather than seasons. "When the wolf decides to hunt instead of hide," Ay Hatun said, her eyes reflecting the firelight like captured pieces of the night sky. "When one of Ashina's descendants has the courage to howl back at those who would make us their dogs, and the wisdom to unite what has been scattered. When the scattered clans remember that they are not separate tribes competing for scraps, but fingers of the same hand, reaching for the same destiny." She drew both boys close to her sides, her warmth a small island of comfort in the vast, cold world that pressed against their tent walls. "Gök Börü still watches over us, little ones. The Blue Wolf that Gök Tengri sent to save our people. She has not forgotten her children, and her promise remains unbroken. But promises require courage to fulfill, and courage requires those willing to pay its price." The fire was burning lower now, its flames dancing with less vigor as the fuel was consumed. One by one, the family began to settle down for sleep. Tuwu rolling himself in furs beside the central post, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had been forced to smile, while his pride was stripped away, piece by piece. Old Börü muttering prayers to spirits whose names were older than written history, his rheumy eyes fixed on visions only he could see. Little Istemi curling up against his mother's side like a wolf cub seeking the warmth and protection of the pack. But Bumin lay awake in the darkness, long after the others had found whatever peace sleep could offer. He stared up at the smoke hole where a few stars were visible through the drifting clouds, their light seeming impossibly distant and cold. His hand kept moving to the silver pendant at his throat, tracing its contours with his fingertips, feeling the weight of 20 generations of dreams and promises and unspoken hopes. Something had changed in the telling of the story. Some fundamental shift in how he understood himself and his place in the world that he couldn't quite name, but could feel as surely as he felt the pendant's weight against his chest. He was no longer the ashamed child who had watched Rouran tax collectors ride away with their horses and their young men. No longer the boy who had believed his people were nothing more than useful servants to foreign masters, who cared nothing for their dignity or their dreams. They were not slaves enduring bondage with broken spirits and downcast eyes. They were wolves waiting for their moment to hunt, seeds gathering strength in the darkness, embers that would one day burst into flame and consume everything that stood in their path. And someday, though he was only 8 years old, and that someday seemed as distant as the stars themselves, someday he would be the one to give the signal. Someday he would howl, and all the scattered children of Gök Börü would hear his call and remember what they were born to be. The pendant grew warm against his skin as sleep finally began to claim him. And in his dreams that were more than dreams, a great blue wolf with eyes like pieces of the eternal sky looked down at him from a mountaintop wreathed in sacred mist and smiled with something that might have been pride or prophecy, or the patient satisfaction of one who sees the future taking its first tentative steps toward fulfillment.